early and often. This is our one opportunity every 2 years to actually have a say in what happens in our government, so I hope we all take advantage of it. We have several announcements before we get to our program. We have a special open forum on Tuesday, May 15th, Election Day. It'll be sponsored by our Business and Labor Standing Committee. It will be on mandated employer-sponsored health insurance. The program will feature Mike McCracken, Associate Director of Policy Development at the Oregon Medical Association, Alan Pinney, who is Director of the Oregon Health Action Campaign and a member of the Insurance Pool Governing Body, Joe Gillian, who is the Oregon State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, and Doug McKee, a member of Associated Oregon Industries and Senior Vice President of Administration and Chief Financial Officer of Payless Drugstores. The program moderator will be City Club member Brian Kelly, who is Clinic Services Manager for Multnomah County Health Division. That program next Tuesday will take place from noon to 1:30 at the U.S. Bancorp Tower, 26th floor conference rooms B and C. It is free and open to the public. We got to get some smaller groups here appearing before City Club. Next Friday we have a very special program and very timely. Stan Long, President and CEO of the publicly owned SAFE Corporation, something that we should all know more about after this week's legislative session. He will be discussing what's wrong with workers' compensation and how the new legislation that was just passed will change that. His talk is entitled Workers' Compensation Prescription for Change. That meeting will be here Friday at noon at the Benson Hotel Mayfair Room. It is a special opportunity as president of the City Club to welcome traveling Oregonians back to Oregon. And our speaker today is one of those people. Alan Weber, who is currently the managing editor of the Harvard Business Review, has spent 10 years in Oregon. He started out at the Oregon Times, moved from there to a little-known city commissioner's office, whose name was Neil Goldschmidt. He stayed with Neil through 5 years at the mayor's office in charge of policy development, went on from there to become editor of the editorial page of Willamette Week, and went from there to the Department of Transportation with Neil Goldschmidt. From there he went on to Harvard and became the associate editor of the Harvard Business Review and has for the past several years been the managing editor. As managing editor, he's had the opportunity to get involved in and learn about many of the important topics of the day as it affects the business community in the world of competition and change, and that is his subject today. He will discuss worldwide competition in the 1990s, define this competition and identify its rules of engagement not only for the United States, but here in Oregon. Competing in the 1990s, what we need to change. Will you help me welcome Alan Weber?
Thank you for that very nice introduction and warm welcome. It's a tremendous honor to be invited to the City Club. It's actually a fulfillment of many years of ambition on my part to be here as a speaker. I was thinking what would dramatize just how special it is for me to be invited back to Portland to speak to the City Club. And I thought of a story about Judge Learned Hand, who was once asked what would be his definition of a perfect day. And Judge Hand said, well, it would start off with a perfect breakfast in bed, steak and eggs served on a beautiful settee that he could eat off of. And then in the middle of the day, there'd be a football game against his arch rival. And his team would be losing with but a few seconds left to play, and he'd go out for a deep pass, and he'd be in the end zone and catch the pass to win the game against his arch rival, and his colleagues would rush up and carry him off the field on their shoulders. And then the whole day would be culminated with a banquet. And since this was just a fabricated event, Judge Hand said at the banquet would be all of the greats of history: Shakespeare, Mozart, Thomas Jefferson, Leonardo da Vinci. And he would be, of course, the guest of honor. He'd be introduced by Voltaire. And just as Voltaire was warming up and celebrating all of Learned Hand's accomplishments, a voice would call out from the back, "Sit down, Voltaire. We want to hear from Learned Hand." The reason that fills the bill for me so nicely is that this is actually my 5th or 6th City Club speech. In the past, I always had to deliver them through Neil Goldschmidt, which was a terrible disadvantage because, as you know, I would write them slowly and he would deliver them quickly. And not only that, but invariably after the event was over, as I was standing in the background, relieved that we had made it through unscathed or relatively unscathed, people would stream out of the City Club meeting and say, "Well, I don't know much about that speech, but he can sure do questions and answers." So it's finally a chance for me to speak without Neil, and I appreciate the invitation. It was roughly 20 years ago at this time that I came to Portland. And last year at this time, I was living in Japan, where I spent 3 months talking with and discussing issues with people that I had identified as the next generation of Japanese leaders, people in business, in government, in the bureaucracy. What I'd like to do today is to draw on both of those experiences, on the time I spent here in Portland and on the time I spent in Tokyo, to talk about the future. And let me start with my conclusions. First of all, the world has already changed, and we've entered a period that can be characterized as fast history, where the rate of change in politics and economics is so swift that the unthinkable has become the commonplace. Secondly, our old assumptions, our habits, our attitudes, our ways of doing business need to be re-examined and reconsidered in the light of these new circumstances. And for managers in particular, I would say many of the old truths that we've learned to live with are today not only obsolete, but are probably liabilities. Third, I think the future has to be characterized as an economic competition between the Japanese and the United States. In fact, a cold peace between the United States and Japan is replacing the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But this cold peace is much more difficult for us to manage than the Cold War, because the Japanese are both our ally and our friend and our competitor and arch rival. And so we have the more difficult task of managing a relationship that is both friendly and competitive, where the relationship with the Soviet Union was clearly one of adversaries. Moreover, our ideology in this country is not geared to direct competition in economic affairs. We continue to think of national security as a military matter, not an economic one. Our philosophy in economics is not to try to win, but rather is geared to enforcing the rules of the game. Finally, I would say the stakes of this competition are enormous. We are talking not only about our economic well-being and our standard of living, the quality of life that we enjoy in this country, but also we're talking about the power and the influence that the United States has in the world. Now, in order to look into the future, it's first necessary to look back. In 1980, 2 Harvard Business School professors, Bob Hayes and Bill Abernathy, published an article in the Harvard Business Review that became an instant classic. It was called "Managing Our Way to Economic Decline." And it said very plainly that the modern management principles of the United States were causing America to falter in global competition rather than promoting our competitive interests. They cited the following as evidence: an excessively short-term orientation with managers fixated on financial controls and quarterly earnings, a preference by managers to eke out marginal growth with existing products rather than risk pioneering a whole new fresh departure or innovative high-risk initiatives, underinvestment in research and development, what they called merger mania, corporate growth through acquisition rather than homegrown innovation, and finally, unhelpful or downright harmful government policies, particularly federal fiscal policy. And they wrote that article in 1980. I think it's useful to look at the decade of the 80s, now that we're starting the 90s, and ask, where do we stand on the Hayes-Abernathy list? Let's take their list in reverse order. First, government policies. In the 1980s, the United States added $1 trillion to the national debt. The federal budget deficit, when you subtract out the trust funds that are used to disguise it, is now at roughly $276 billion, or 4.1% of the GNP, twice the rate of the 1970s. We are now importing $10 billion per month in foreign capital, and the Japanese are financing 30% of the U.S. federal budget deficit. Our bilateral trade deficit with the Japanese hovers at around $50 billion, and this despite the currency devaluations of the past several years that were designed, in theory at least, to adjust the trade deficit. And so we are facing, in government policy, a double whammy. American business has to try to overcome the high cost of capital, which hinders our companies from making investments in equipment and technology, and at the same time, the federal government has been disinvesting from education and infrastructure, the kinds of public investment that can help the private sector be more competitive. What about merger mania? Well, merger mania that they warned us about in 1980, during the decade of the 80s, became an epidemic. The 80s were nothing but binges of Wall Street buyouts, hostile takeovers, and LBOs. We saw created something that had no name until the 1980s, the market for corporate control. And in 1989 alone, there were $77 billion of LBOs. In all of the 1980s, something on the order of $1.3 trillion was spent in this country shuffling corporate assets in one way or another. And yet today, 40% of the LBOs in the United States are missing their debt payments. And of course, as everyone knows, Drexel itself is out of business. What about R&D? Well, R&D was made worse in the 1980s by takeovers, which slowed and in fact cut back in absolute terms the spending on research and development. A recent National Science Foundation report indicates in 1989 an actual drop in R&D spending in this country, in absolute terms, the first actual drop since 1975. They made the point in their article that our managers showed a preference for marginal growth over innovation. And if you look at patents and new product introduction, you can see that in the 1980s, the pattern continued. 5 out of the top 10 corporations in the United States today that are patenting things are Japanese. And if you compare the areas in which the Japanese are getting their patents with the areas in which the United States is taking out patents, the picture is even more distressing. The Japanese are taking out patents in photocopying, optical recording, electronic platters, magnetic tape and disc, and recording technology. The United States is taking out patents in oil wells, fishing, amusement and exercise devices, games, and trapping vermin. The United States now ranks 6th in the world among countries obtaining scientific patents. And if you look at the industries of the future, just take one example, biotechnology. Each year, Japan introduces 3 times the biomedical products that the United States introduces. And they are twice as fast as we are in bringing new products to market, whether we're talking about new cars or the flexible manufacturing that Sony talks about when they describe the way they bring a shower of new products that fill up the entire spectrum of the market in audio and tape recording. Now, of course, when Hayes and Abernathy wrote their article, the concern was for basic U.S. manufacturing, for autos and steel, machine tools, rubber, glass. The presumption in 1980 was that the U.S. lead in high-tech was secure, and no one was even thinking about issues that concerned industries like financial services. But of course, today, 10 years later, that's all changed as well. In 1979, in high-tech, the United States supplied nearly 60% of the world's microchips. Today, that number is less than 39%. If you look at the United States' global market share in 13 pieces of high-tech equipment, the United States no longer leads in any of them. According to a 1987 Defense Science Board survey of 25 microelectronics technologies, the United States leads in only 3, is gaining ground in only 1, and the Japanese dominate all the rest. When I was in Japan, I made it a point to stop by the offices of the American Electronics Association to talk to John Stern, who was the executive director there. He predicted to me, quite openly, that by 1992, the United States will lose its lead in semiconductors. By 1994, we'll lose its lead in computers. And by 1997, we'll lose its lead in telecommunications. And in fact, today, we are already importing $4 billion more in computers from the Japanese than we export. When you turn to financial services, where the power of money is the game, the picture is much the same. Of the 10 largest banks in the world, 10 are Japanese. Citicorp, the largest United States bank, ranked by its deposit base, is considered a minor Japanese bank. In fact, Japan's 13 largest banks have more than 5 times the capitalization of the 50 largest U.S. banks, and based on their scale alone, enjoy at least 0.5% cost of funds advantage. If you look at the penetration of the U.S. market by Japanese financial industries, Japanese banks now have 25% of California's banking market, and knowledgeable observers suggest that in the mid-1990s, the Japanese will have just that same figure as a percent of the entire U.S. commercial loan market. If you look globally, Japanese banks now account for 40% of all international bank assets, up from 20% just 7 years ago. And according to one New York Times article, a Mitsubishi subsidiary offered to buy all of Brazil's foreign debt for 130 billion yen in exchange for the exclusive right to all of Brazil's gold mines valued at roughly 260 billion yen. The first example that I'm aware of an LBO of a nation. The Brazilians, to their credit, declined the deal. What's going on here? Well, I would suggest there are 3 powerful forces at work that are transforming competition: globalization, technology, and human capital. And that today, all 3 of these forces have one common name, and that is Japan. All 3 of these forces are embodied in Japan's challenge to the United States for global economic leadership. And these 3 forces are what the 1990s will be all about. Globalization, to me, consists of 3 separate categories of activities. First and foremost, however, it is to be understood as the erosion of borders or boundaries or national barriers. It means that competition can come from anywhere in any industry. I finally understood globalization in its most pronounced form when I was in Tokyo last year and made a side trip to Kyoto. And there I stayed for 3 days in facilities provided by a Buddhist monk. When I went to the monk's small guest quarters, he met me at the door wearing flowing robes with his head shaven and proceeded to show me around the quarters where I would stay. He took me into the bath, and there on the shelf over the sink was a bottle of Vidal Sassoon shampoo. And I wondered to myself, does this Buddhist monk know that if he doesn't look good, Vidal Sassoon doesn't look good? Probably. Because that's the way products move today. But more than just products, globalization is an attitude. It's an end to insularity and myopia, to the sense that was part of the American heritage that our market was so large and so rich and so expansive and so open that we need not look beyond our own borders. Today, the Commerce Department of the United States reports there are 10,000 U.S. corporations which could compete globally, but which simply don't bother. So our attitude is part of globalization. Secondly, globalization is institutional. It's a set of skills and lessons and standards learned and implemented in company operations from around the world. One of the things that globalization makes crystal clear is that the United States no longer sets the standard for organizational structure, management systems, worker training, capabilities, or productivity, or for the whole set of things that go together to add up to high quality, low cost, fast to market, innovative companies. And third, globalization is political. It means that we're no longer in a competition where the competition is one company versus another company, Ford versus General Motors. We're now in a competition between systems, between a national system in Japan and a national system in the United States, a national system in Europe, Germany, or elsewhere. And those systems are made up of sets of relationships between the public and private sector, between companies and their customers, companies and their suppliers, companies and even their competitors, and perhaps most important, companies and their employees. The second force that's transforming competition is technology. And technology is driving globalization in two very distinct ways. First, there is a convergence of process, and second, there is a convergence of product. What do I mean? Well, process convergence very simply means that production can take place anywhere in the world. Korean semiconductors are every bit as good as Japanese semiconductors. Brazilian computers are as good as the computers made in the United States. Telephones in Kuala Lumpur. And the same is true with services. Thanks to the power of information technology, law firms can be located anywhere and do business anywhere. Architects can receive faxes from all over the world and transmit drawings anywhere in the world. And management consultants are in fact a globalized industry now. In product convergence, we're witnessing the digitization of everything. It means very simply that information is being reduced to digits, and separate industries and streams of technology are coming together into a single conglomerated stream. It's called in Japanese, or in the Japanese economy, they refer to it as techno-fusion, where computers and telecommunications, semiconductors and fax machines are going from separate industries to $1 trillion global industry. That leaves human capital. And the simple equation of global competition is this: globalization plus technology equals people. Everything else can easily move across national borders. You can buy it or lease it, you can borrow it, you can license it. In the case of computer technology, we've witnessed it being stolen. The one thing that doesn't move is people. They are the one part of the competitive equation that each nation, each company, each community has to itself and must invest in and depend on. Now, the original theory back a decade or more was that globalization plus technology would diminish the importance of people, that you could substitute technology for labor. and then move your factory to the lowest wage country, or just de-skill your people at home. But the Japanese have taught us that technology and change require higher skills and increase the importance of workers who do not what they are told, but whatever is needed to make the company competitive. A real item that appeared as a want ad in the New York Times of December 1988 read as follows. It's a help wanted ad. Wanted floor sweeper. Required the ability to operate electronic controls on a cleaning machine and to mix ratios of water and cleaning solution accurately. Today, even a floor sweeper no longer means just pushing a broom. A floor sweeper today has to be a knowledge worker, and a mistake in mixing chemicals or controlling the electronic controls could cost the company thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. One way or another, a competitive organization has to find a way to redraw the boundaries to allow all their workers to contribute. But if you look at how the United States is doing on this critical area of human capital, we are simply not keeping up. I took a tour while I was in Japan of an auto factory. The manager was very proud as he walked me around his assembly plant, proud of how clean it was and how modern the technology was. And at the end of our tour, he said to me, "You know, there's one piece of equipment that all of our workers have that your workers don't have." I looked around the factory floor. I saw very typical auto making equipment. So I said to him, I don't see it. What is it?" He reached into his pocket and he pulled out a pencil. He said, "All of our workers have a pencil. And if they see anything that could be done more productively or efficiently, or a way to improve the process or make the product higher quality, they write it down and they pass those suggestions forward." I took this message to my friends in Detroit. One man said to me, "Well, that's probably true. It's probably true that our workers don't have pencils and their workers do. But it wouldn't help if we gave our workers pencils because 40% of our factory workers are functionally illiterate." That's the challenge. According to a report of U.S. secondary school principals, they grade the nations of the world as follows. U.S. schools get a C-, German schools get a B+, Korean schools get an A-. 1/4 of all U.S. ninth graders today don't complete high school. And if you think the problem is that we're wasting money, or you're susceptible to the argument that we should not simply throw money at a problem, according to a recent study, the United States spends less on elementary and secondary education than 13 other industrial countries. Only Ireland and Australia trail behind us. And what does this mean for Oregon and for the United States? Well, coming back to Portland, it struck me that Oregon is, in a way, to the United States as the United States is to Japan and the rest of the world. And that is, in both cases, there are two very powerful and conflicting instincts. The first is the feeling that anything can happen here. This is a place as a state, and the United States in comparison to the rest of the world, is a place where common sense and pragmatism and independence of mind can look hard at difficult facts and reach a conclusion that makes sense. I'm reminded of the way Glenn Jackson came to the conclusion that Harbor Drive could and should be closed. He said he knew it could be closed when he looked at the amount of time it took for a car to drive from one end of downtown Portland to the other using Harbor Drive in the mid-'70s and realized that it hadn't appreciably improved since the days of horses and wagons. Then he knew Harbor Drive was expendable. The same attitude of openness of mind, of willingness to confront a problem and come up with a common sense solution, typified all the work that I was involved in the 1970s. The decision on the Mount Hood Freeway, the runway and the Columbia River, the bottle bill, land use planning, The list goes on. You're familiar with it. It's a spirit of opportunity and independence that says anything can happen. But there's another side to that coin, and it's a notion that conflicts with it. It is the notion that nothing needs to happen here. It's a sense of status quoism, of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. At the national level, it's don't worry, be happy. And what it leads to that's very dangerous is not only complacency, but a willingness for change to overwhelm us so that we have to confront it after the status quo has been swept away. And the result are radical swings. Rather than a constantly rising level of effort measured against a constantly rising set of expectations, we fluctuate from dealing with a crisis to resting during a period of relative plenty. At the national level, it's happening with the competitiveness issue. There is very little acknowledgement of our competitive problems vis-a-vis the Japanese, and just last week, 2 top officials at the Pentagon who were charged with research of commercial applications of advanced technology were fired for promoting too much cooperation between the government and high-tech industries. The most important lesson that I took away from my time in Oregon is the inscription on the Skidmore fountain. It says, "Good citizens are the riches of the city." It was an inscription that I took to heart when I was here, and I think it's true of Portland, I think it's true of Oregon, I think it's true of the United States as we look around the world. And there are 2 elements of good citizenship that I think really mark the Oregon spirit. The first is passion, and the second is conflict. And it's harnessing passion and conflict that take the spirit that says anything can happen here and puts that spirit to use in a constructive way. It takes people who care deeply about what happens in their community or their country and who are then willing to fight for it and argue for it, and in the case of Portland, to canvass for it. It takes constructive conflict that is willing to deal with shaping and creating a strategy for the future. It's true for Portland, it's true for the United States. The next decade, I believe, will be a difficult one and an exciting one. The United States can either continue to fall behind or, quickened by the end of the Cold War, apply energy and discipline to this new global economic competition. It's going to take hard work rather than complacency and a recommitment to the fundamentals. It will take a willingness to invest in education, in our children, a willingness to forego the easy way, and the discovery of a new hunger for competitiveness. I learned in Portland in the 1970s that trend is not destiny, that if you confront the hard truths with sound thinking and solid values, that's the way for a community to create its own future. I think that model holds in our competition with the Japanese. Our values are fundamentally sound. The values of independence and common sense and pragmatism, of opportunity for all. That's really the American spirit. And that's the lesson that Oregon needs to remind itself of in the 1990s, and perhaps by reminding itself of that lesson, teach it to the rest of the United States. In the Winter Olympics at Lake Placid, the hockey coach, Herb Brooks, before the team took the ice to play the Soviet Union, said, "If you want to play this game, bring along your hard hat and your lunch pail. Otherwise, you might as well stay home." That's the message for the 1990s. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. He wanted me to announce at this time that that speech was not written by Neil Goldschmidt. As most of you know, I am sure, now is the question and answer portion of our program. There is a microphone being placed in the center of the room for those of you with the courage to ask an oral question. If you are shy, there are forms on your table for a written question. Please hold it up so the staff can bring it forward. We give priority to those of you that are brave and speak right up into the microphone. Our first question will come from our board host today, who is Cheryl Warren. She is a member of the Board of Governors, chair of our membership committee, one of our toughest assignments she is handling very ably, and also is executive director of the YWCA. Cheryl?
I would like you to return, Alan, to the subject of banking in Japan. It seemed that your remarks would suggest that bigger is better, and ask you if that could translate to the United States, or are there things in our country's banking policy that might get in the way of that, such as security of the depositors' monies and so forth? And will the United States, will our sort of natural distrust of things that are big get in the way?
Well, that's a good question. The Japanese have a completely different attitude towards the role of the bank, and a very different set of laws and regulations that govern banks. I can't tell you how long the talk has gone on in this country about repealing the Glass-Steagall Act. It's at least a decade, as we've talked about it. I don't see any sign that it's going to happen. The Japanese have an incredibly powerful system that uses the banks to underwrite corporate investments. At least 30% of the equity in most of the large Japanese corporations is owned by their lead bank, and so it really affects directly the issue of long-term perspective. The hardest part in competing against the Japanese for most American businesses, if you talk to them, is the feeling by American CEOs of what they would call the tyranny of Wall Street, and the requirement to be on a quarterly pace. That's not part of the Japanese economic system. The keiretsu system, or family system of companies that are all related and intertwined in their holdings, gives them stability and a long-term focus, so that, for example, NEC, when they were trying to bring semiconductors to the market, lost money for 10 years and knew that they had no problem with their shareholders. I can't see the United States fundamentally changing our banking laws to move in that direction. I do think we are very distrustful of bigness in general. We have a unique approach to antitrust. The rest of the world doesn't practice antitrust the way we do. And I would think that one of the most important agenda items for a place like the Harvard Business School is to think about ways to deal with this long-term, short-term trade-off without having to change dramatically our approach to banking, because I don't think it's going to happen.
I am member Gilbert Lamb. Mr. Weber, under your subject, competing in the 1990s, what we need to change, I am surprised no mention was made of the military. The USA spends unlimited amounts on our military, and Japan and Germany, by their losing the war, were signed treaties where they wouldn't spend. Doesn't that need to be changed?
Good question. I think it is changing. The Japanese actually are spending, they are the third largest defense expenditure nation in the world at the moment. And we are sourcing a substantial amount of our military high-tech equipment from Japan, which is something that perhaps we should think about. The fact is, though, you're right, the discussion of the peacetime economy is a very important one. And I think that one of the most hopeful signs that we can all look at, and I confess that there's a somewhat depressing tinge to some of the data that I was providing you today about how America is competing. The hopeful sign that I see is not just that we will spend less on defense, but that this large economic enterprise that is the United States economy, as it's represented by human capital, will begin to pay more attention to the market for commercial items, for using our R&D and our technology to produce commercially valuable and viable products rather than military items. And I think that's a great opportunity, and I think you can actually begin to see the battleship turning, but it's a very slow process.
Todd Blickenstaff, City Club member. You mentioned the fixation on quarterly earnings, and particularly with a concentration of shareholder voting power and institutional ownership. What is your remedy to suggest a more long-range viewpoint in this country?
Well, that's the way I tried to deal with that was by suggesting it's an agenda item rather than something that I have a solution for. You aren't buying that, huh? I don't have a solution. I don't have a solution. As a matter of fact, if any of you do have a solution, it's one of the items that I'm looking for as a great article for the Harvard Business Review. Michael Porter, who is a professor at the business school and has just written a terrific book on the competitive advantage of nations, has now embarked on a study with the Council on Competitiveness, which is headquartered in Washington, just on this subject. And I've seen the outline of the work that they're going to do. It examines everything from the issue of banks and bank regulation to questions of ways of changing the reporting of corporations, changing the periodicity. I don't think there is an easy solution. I would say this: the best run companies in the United States today will tell you that they don't think there's a problem. The best run companies tell you that they are able to manage well for the short term and the long term. Not long ago, I was in St. Louis at Emerson Electric, which has one of the most remarkable financial performances in the United States over the last 20 years. And Chuck Knight, who is their CEO, was describing to me how they manage for the short and long term without seeing it as a trade-off. And his philosophy is, if you do the things you need to do in the short term, you will be well fixed for the long term. If you manage your cash flow correctly, you will be good to your shareholders and good to your corporation. That doesn't deal with the rest of the CEOs who still think there's an enormous problem. And I am unable to provide you with an answer, but I think it's a top agenda item for people to work on.
Richard Berman. I was wondering, in all that I've read, the incredible concentration of wealth in Japan has not resulted in an incredibly high standard of living. And I was wondering whether there is any movement in Japan towards colonization, moving outside of their country to places where real estate is less expensive.
No. It is true that the country is very rich and the people aren't particularly rich. They have a very different attitude towards wealth than the United States has. They don't, for the most part, look at wealth as a matter of individual accomplishment. It's much more to be shared. Rich company, poor people, you hear a lot. They also have a very interesting philosophy of what I would call leveraging the middle. 96 or 97% of the people in Japan would describe themselves as being middle class. And until the recent land price boom that escalated land price in Tokyo and elsewhere out of control, which created some instant millionaires, the basic way in which people improved their standard of living was gradually. Everybody moving as a group, a little bit at a time. And so the middle was leveraged. Our model in this country is the case of the missing middle. We've had the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and the people in the middle being pulled to try to make it across the divide. Very different attitude towards why you work and what wealth constitutes. They are not looking to move out of Japan. They are, I think, beginning to realize that the country is wealthy and that people do, as consumers, have more rights than they did in the past. So when you go to Japan, you will be told Japan is changing. It is. There are signs of it. It's very slow. But the consumer is getting more power and becoming somewhat impatient with what he or she sees as a very wealthy country where the consumer is not particularly well treated at the cash register.
Austin Leach, City Club. You alluded briefly to some of the programs that are being done through the MBA program at Harvard. Could you tell us more about what is being done in that program, the Advanced Management Program, and how these programs then might be shared or developed in conjunction with the other major business administration schools throughout the country?
Well, there is an effort being made through the Advanced Management Program and the other senior executive programs to globalize the matters that are taught, to really upgrade the curriculum and bring it much more closely into touch with the day-to-day experiences that managers are having to contend with. There is an emphasis on interactive technology, for example, bringing computers into the classroom and making them a part of the learning experience, and a very strong effort to move much more directly to cases, which is still the teaching vehicle, that are current and fresh and reflect the changes that are so rapidly taking place around the world. And I think that's very healthy. The school is also being very aggressive in promoting the dissemination of information through all the different forms of technology that are now proliferating. Videotapes, audio tapes, taking the cases and turning them into case books that people can buy and use on their own, and really packaging up the knowledge that is created at the business school and finding a way to get it widely disseminated and into as many people's hands in various institutions as possible. So it's not just links with other business schools, it's with the teaching programs at universities that have been started by companies. And I think that's very hopeful. I think that's a very creative solution to trying to gear up the intellectual capital that's in the business community and bring it much more into touch with what's happening in the new economy that we're all struggling to stay up with. And of course, we are promoting the subscriptions to the Harvard Business Review as a terrific way to maintain your graduate education in management after you've moved into the ranks of the business community.
Mike Hoffman, City Club member. I'd like to know what you think will happen with the fall in the Japanese stock market and its effect on the U.S. bond market and the possible fall in the value of real estate consequently in Japan.
I think that what the Japanese call the correction in the Japanese stock market is, to my best estimate, much ado about nothing. It's quite remarkable that the companies that are exporting so much in the way of technology and finished products are still doing terrific on the Japanese stock market. And what you're seeing is the companies that, as you suggested, were really seeing their stocks appreciate because of the land holdings that they happen to have, those stocks dropped. You didn't see a ripple effect around the world on the other stock markets, which suggests to me that in spite of the fact that we talk about a global economy where information travels rapidly and the stock market is open 24 hours a day, this is really an event confined to the rather eccentric behavior of the Japanese stock market over time and the excess rise that we saw on the Japanese stock market over the last year or so, largely related to land prices. The land price increase in Tokyo has slowed, although not stopped. I think the real underpinnings of the Japanese economy haven't changed, and the underpinnings of the Japanese economy are in the productive capacity that they have for componentry, the high-tech componentry, the semiconductors that we can't do without, and the finished goods, whether it's autos or audio equipment, that we buy in the billions of dollars, none of which has changed or slowed in the least. So I think the Japanese stock market, I was amused when Business Week had on their cover something to the effect of, can the Japanese cope? When a year before Business Week had on its cover, are the Japanese taking over the world? I would suggest the answer is the Japanese are coping quite well, thank you very much, and there's a lot of work to be done in the United States in relearning how to manufacture, because until we do that, we're not going to be competitive.
Edith Zabin, member of the City Club. The various technologies and industries which you enumerated and gave the percentages that when we were leaders, and now the percentage that has fallen. Are these industries and technologies, is it Japan now globally the leader in those that we once had?
For the most part, the Japanese are globally the leaders in the industries and the technologies that I ticked off. And it's interesting when you think about those technologies, whether it's autos or steel in the earlier days, or now semiconductors and some of the television and other equipment into which the semiconductors go. I cannot think of a single example where the United States has fallen behind the Japanese in producing that product and subsequently figured out a retrieval strategy, a way to return into the industry and recover lost market share. I am pressed to think of one example. The Japanese seem to be able not only to master the manufacturing of these products, but also once they've mastered the capacity to produce high quality and low cost products, to continue to innovate and to continue to proliferate the products so that we are left behind. Having gotten off the train, we have a very difficult time getting back on the train as it picks up speed. That's the challenge. We now have to learn from the Japanese.
I'm Ray Polani, member of the City Club. Alan, how are you?
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. How about competitive in transportation, Alan? I keep thinking that almost every other government in the world is heavily investing in rail. With us, it's an absolute no-no. We invest in the competitiveness to rail, but not in rail itself. What do you see in the future?
Well, if you think of the spectrum of industries that make up the transportation industry, I think you'd have to say that the Japanese, with the exception of aerospace, which was what the big fight over the FSX plane was about, the Japanese have done quite well. Automobiles, you would have to say that at this point they are the global leader in automobiles. They did the pioneering work in bullet train activities. They have a phenomenal subway system in Tokyo. They are quite adept at the infrastructure of transportation. I'm thinking not only of highways, but even more important perhaps, air traffic control and the technology that goes into that. Maglev and other forms of rail. I suppose if the United States wants to get into it, we'll have to buy the product from the Japanese. Aerospace is, at the moment, the only industry in which we have a competitive edge, and FSX was all about that, and most recently the Boeing decision to rather confine the joint venture that they were going to go into with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was an attempt to circumscribe the technology sharing for fear that if the Japanese did heavily get into aerospace, once again we would find our competitive edge eroded. So I think your point is a good one. Transportation is a major vehicle, no pun intended, for creating competitive industries. All of the components that go into making a car, for example, are easily applied to other industrial activities. And if you're going to have a competitive auto industry, you also need to have a competitive steel industry and electronics and so on. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Japanese focused on autos early on as a source of national industrial growth.
Last question.
City Club, Mamba Club. I know it's very fashionable to admire the Japanese, and I'd like to buck the trend and ask you, what are the minuses or the weak points of the Japanese system or Japanese economy and so forth?
That's a very good question, because it's easy to stand up here and report to you how powerful the Japanese economic system is, and not to take into account many of the things that we would find less than admirable about life in Japan. We talked a little bit about the high cost of living. Rich companies relatively poor people. There are a number of facets to life in Japan that are less than admirable. One of the things that an American is struck by when you're living there for 3 months is the notion of social control. You hear quite frequently the saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And it sounds like a cute saying, but the fact is that when you are the nail that sticks up, being hammered down does not feel very good. Short anecdote, I went to a couple of baseball games while I was in Tokyo. And in Japan, the rule is that a foul ball has to be returned. I think it's largely for safety reasons. They don't want people fighting over foul balls. Well, I was sitting in the stands at one ball game, and my friend, who was Japanese, snared a foul ball and gave it to me. And I thought, this is great. I can take this home and give it to my children as a souvenir. Well, the guard came around to collect the foul ball, and all of the Japanese who were sitting around me knew that I had this foul ball secreted away in my pocket. And all of them turned and stared at me with very clear conviction that I was breaking the rules. And the level of intensity of their look was so strong that I had no choice. I had to give back the baseball. Now, that is a trivial example of a sense of group harmony and living by the rules and social control that I think most of us would find very difficult to live in. The conditions for women, I would say, are difficult. Most women, when they graduate from university, if they apply for a job, are given a choice. They can either be office ladies and serve tea and escort visitors to and from the elevator, or they can agree to work as if they were a man, which means they'll be posted anywhere. One of the women I met in my time in Tokyo was the highest ranking official, woman official, in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, this lofty government ministry that is so responsible for Japan's strategy from the government side in economic affairs. She and her husband, who is also a meaty official, had been married for 13 years at that time, had 2 children, and had lived together for less than half of their married life. Because in order to be a meaty official, she had to agree to move wherever the government, her employer, told her to go. This is not something that most Americans would find convivial. The list goes on. It is a very rigid society with strict rules of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Individualism is not part of the national value system. And I think a lot of the Japanese who live in the United States on assignment, when they discover it's time for them to go back to Japan, many of them find it very difficult because they've gotten accustomed to what is our comfortable way of life. I guess if I were going to conclude, I would say it's that comfortable way of life, however, that we have to be a little bit careful about. We can assume that as long as the Japanese are sending us 1/3 of our federal budget deficit, we're entitled to buy all the consumer goods we want. We're entitled to our weekends at the shore and our weekends at the mountain skiing. The Japanese are still working, most of them, a 6-day work week. Their children are cramming to get into school, to go to the best schools so that their careers will be successful. Though they have a wealthy country, they work as if they didn't believe the wealth were going to last. And I would suggest that somewhere between our sense of individualism and personal opportunity and their sense of discipline and pride in quality and service is the synthesis that really both of our countries, need to try to accomplish in the 1990s so that our ally and our rival can live in mutual harmony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for a very special presentation. I hope you will all be back next week for Stan Long from the State Accident Insurance Fund, and we are adjourned.